Hey, hello everybody, welcome back to Momo vs. MTG. Today, we'll be taking a look at probably, I hate to be biased, but probably my favorite deck that I've ever created. It's called Hacky Sacky Lands, and let's take a look without further ado. So, for the commander, we're running Queen Kaayla, Bin Krog, for 3 mana, 2 of it being Boros, get a legendary creature, Human Noble. 4 mana, discard all the cards in your hand, then draw that many cards. You may choose an artifact or creature with mana value 1 you discard this way, then do the same for an artifact or creature cards with mana value 2 and 3. Return those cards to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So, truth be told with this deck, I was fumbling around with what commander I should run for it. Originally, I had Plarg, Dean of Chaos, and flip side, of course, Augusta, Dean of Order, mainly for the white, because you usually want to be casting this for its front side here, because it gives you a free discard and draw outlet every turn, and dropping this on turn 2 always feels nice. And later in the game, 5 mana, reveal your cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary, non-land card with mana value 3 or less. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. Put all revealed cards not cast this way at the bottom of your library in random order. So, I was cycling through commanders. Originally this, I said. Queen Kaayla. I took a look at Garrod, Weatherlight Hero. And lastly, I've been looking at Jenny, Generated Anomaly. She's 4 mana, double strike, deals combat damage to player, it explores. So the focus of this deck is basically pseudo landfall, but a really heavy land theme of sacking lands, recurring lands, and so on. It's a bit of doozy of a deck, but it has some really interesting and neat lines, and every game feels super unique with it. And the reason I didn't go with Jenny yet is you'd have to alter the deck because you want to be dealing combat damage with a creature, your commander in particular, and it's not geared towards having evasion built in. So I may take a look at this further down the line, but Queen Kaayla seems to generate the most value because I find myself oftentimes having a lot of cards in hand and being able to wheel whether or not you're getting value off the second part in the command zones seems pretty nice to have. Without further ado, let's jump right into this bad boy. Let's start out with the ramp package. I have 2 sections ramp here. You can see one's pretty generic, and the other is ramping, searching for plains cards, basic land cards in particular, because we are running 35 lands, but mostly basics here, and with a couple exceptions, which I'll touch on. So, for instance, we have, Soul Ring, Arcane Signet, sort of the Animus, some generic ramp. And then we have funny stuff like Oath of Lieges, and let's take a look at this card here. It reads, at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player chooses target player who controls more lands than they do, and is their opponent. The first player may search the library for a basic card and put that onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So this is a really neat and basically sums up white in a nutshell, where it's the catch-up mechanic, right? If you're behind in lands, you want to see a green player at the table, generally speaking, right? Because they're going to be getting more lands, so to speak. But Oath of Lieges loves to see that because you can catch up, per se, by choosing that player with more lands. You have 4, they have 6 by turn 3 or 4, and you'll be getting land drops like that. Also, the rest of the table loves to see this card. It's a fun, neat little card. It's like, hey, go get a basic. Really neat stuff, and fits extremely well in their deck, as we will dive into. Other cards, or the Animus. Basically, this deck is looking to get all the lands out of its deck, whether it be in the graveyard or on the battlefield, and we'll go into how it does that. For instance, Keeper of the Cord will do this every turn, and is very powerful in the deck. Because for 4-drop, creates a 1/1 if they have more creatures than you at the beginning of each opponent's end step. And same thing for lands. Search for a basic land card if you're behind in lands. So every cycle, this is on the field, it's going to be generating a lot of value in our deck, and we'll go into that. And I think the absolute all-star pairing of the deck, you got land tax here. Beginning of your upkeep, opponent controls more lands than you. Search your library for up to 3 basic lands. Reveal them, put them in your hand, then shuffle. Paired with Archaeomancer map. Kind of does the same thing. Search for 2 basic land cards, put them in your hand. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under opponent control, if that player controls more lands than you, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. So paired with Oath of Lieges, which we touched on in the beginning, it's a neat little mechanic where not only are you catching up on lands per se, but you're getting ahead on land drops the further the game goes on. And we abuse this mechanic in this deck with some sack outlets for our lands. And let's take a look at all the ways we can get rid of our lands. And you're saying to yourself, why get rid of lands? What's that going to do to put us ahead? And let me show you right here. So something like a greater Gargadon, has a spend 10. So for 1 red mana, you could put this creature out here and suspend and have a sack outlet on demand. Because it has sacrifice, artifact, creature, land, remove time counter. So we're looking all the ways to get rid of our lands. Zurian Orb, fantastic, keeps us alive with some life gain, but most importantly, sacks the lands. I will note that this is not a commander legal card. It's kind of funny. I rule 0 with the play groups I play with, and most of them are okay with it. But it can be easily replaced with some other card. But it reads, sacrifice creature land, add half a red mana to your mana pool. Of course, you can't really do that in Magic, so that's why it's rule zeroed in if I do pull up to the table with this. Other cards, Need for Speed, red mana, sack, give a creature haste nice, but sacrifice a land, trouble healer, prevent 2 damage to be dealt to target creature or player this turn, the next 2 damage, and sacred land. So in combination with land tax and Archaeomancer map, we can constantly be fetching, and for that for those reasons, thing or deck out of basic lands every turn cycle, or even every just turn someone ends their turn, which is pretty powerful effect, and a neat little thing if you get it all set up, because then, with bearing that in mind, with the sack outlets of lands, we can look at cards like Boreas Charger here. And this card reads, for 3 mana, when Boreas Charger leaves the battlefield, choose an opponent who controls more lands than you, search your library for the number of plains cards equal to the difference, reveal those cards, put one of them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest into your hand. So a neat interaction is if, let's say, someone has 6 or 7 lands on the battlefield, right? And so do you. Anytime, you could sacrifice all your lands, and also Boros Charger, for that matter, and then you will go down to 0 lands on the battlefield. Trigger this, you get at least to put 1 land back onto the battlefield, and the rest into your graveyard, while also getting 7 lands out of your deck, 6 of them going into your hand. And you might be thinking to yourself, why in the world would I do that? Because we have a whole bunch of fun spells like this. Gerard's Hourglass Pendant. We have the Recursion all spells, right? So for 1 mana, flash. Player begin an extra turn, skip that turn instead. Sure. 4 mana, tap, exile Gerard's Hourglass Pendant, return to the battlefield tapped all artifact, creatures, enchantment, and land cards from your graveyard that were put there from the battlefield this turn. So, effects like this is being one of the weaker ones, extremely powerful, because then we have Fate's Reward, same idea, instant, and they don't come in tapped, which is the key part here. So not only are we getting 7 lands out of our deck, we are also returning to the battlefield the 7 lands we originally sacked and generating. We're netting mana. You can also float mana by this means, right? This costs 4 to cast, and we sack 7 lands. We're already up 3 white mana. And other effects, cosmic intervention, same thing. Returns permanents to the battlefield that were put there in the graveyard this turn. Second sunrise, also same thing, but for each player, and is cheaper. So now we're up 4 mana if we casted this one instead. And the way to really take this over the top and really abuse it is something like a scholarship sponsor. So this card reads, when scholarship sponsor enters the battlefield, each player controls fewer lands, and a player who controls the most lands searches their library for a number of basic land cards less than or equal to the difference, puts those cards in the battlefield tapped and shuffles. So this is the point in the game where we could, let's say we have 7 lands and our opponent has 7 lands. We sack all our lands, cast this funny fella, right? We're automatically getting 7 basic lands onto the battlefield. After that, cast something like Second Sunrise, and there we go. We're getting a total of 14 lands onto the table for a 2-card combo with a sack outlet, so 3. Needless to say, you're staring at a Boros player over there, pretty funny. I don't think he's going to get a lot of lands, but there are numerous different ways in this deck to get ahead on land drops, which is huge. I think it's extremely powerful when utilized correctly. And with this land sacking theme, there's all sorts of funny things to jump into. I'm going to be jumping all over the page in this deck, but let's run through scenario by scenario. So something like here, the Spiteful Repossession is a fun one because it reads, Spiteful Repossession deals damage to each opponent who controls more lands than you and equal to the difference. Then create a number of treasure tokens equal to the damage dealt this way. So a really fun interaction is ask everybody how many lands you have on the table. They'll tell you the numbers. You proceed to sacrifice all your lands, floating the mana in the process, so that you cast Spiteful Repossession. So you're sitting there with mana floating and 0 lands. This is going to be dealing a ton of damage to your opponents, at the same time creating a ton of treasures, so you can cast your recursion spells to not only get so far ahead with treasures, but also still getting your lands back in the same time. Which is a really neat thing, really neat way to get the maximum value out of this card. I think the last game I was a part of, I ended up having a winning line with Spiteful Repossession and then something like an Underworld Breach, which was really cool to see because I was generating a ton of mana and dealing a ton of damage to my opponents since they all had at least 1 or more lands than me. By going through the line, because our graveyard was full of lands and other things. But the second key part of this deck is, on that note, is you want a ton of lands in the graveyard. So that's why Plarg was really cool to see, because every turn I could pitch a land to the graveyard, draw a card. Especially with land tax out, I could be pitching a land every turn into the graveyard, which is exactly what I want. In particular, basic lands, but all lands count for that matter. And Queen Kaayla was able to pitch a ton of lands to the graveyard. So going down that rabbit hole, the reason why we want all the lands in our graveyard is this card in particular, Planner Rebirth. Really cool card. For 2 mana, put all basic lands from all graveyards into play under their owner's control tapped. So let's say we've been wheeling a decent bit. We have like 15 land cards, basic land cards for that matter, in our graveyard by now over the course of maybe 4 or 5 turns with land tax out, accruing these lands and then discarding them to the hand size rule even, or by wheeling them away. For 2 mana, we're going to be recurring all those lands. Your opponents may have a couple lands, basic lands in the graveyard, but usually not. But if they do, sure, they get some value. Because this affects all players. You'll be getting 15 lands from your graveyard for 2 mana. They come in tapped, so I've accounted for something like that. For You have something like a Amulet of Vigor or a Tiller Engine on the field, because now they become lands that you can use right away. Because whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, choose one, untap that land, tap non-land permanent. Nice utility too. Amulet of Vigor, same thing for 1 mana. Really cool card. Whenever a permanent enters the battlefield, tap under your control, untap it. So now we get these lands right away, and we can do some fun stuff. Originally, the direction, as you can see from here, Landfall Kings, is I went down the Landfall route, which you definitely can do. I just found the burning players for damage kind of deal a lot more suited to what I wanted to look for, but you could go for Boros Landfall very easily, because those 15 lands coming in, you can create, let's say, 10 2/2 cats with Landfall because of that, and put a 1/1 on each of those creatures, and all of a sudden you have a bunch of 7/7 cat beast creature tokens, which is really cool to see as well. And of course, the other Landfall decks, which you can take a look for yourself. But Bond Me to Fury, animate those lands, landfall, so on and so forth. The last one I'll take a look at is Retreat to Myria. If you want the landfall route, definitely can go for it. It's super cool. So, and because with that, we want as many lands not only on the battlefield or in the graveyard. So both are really good for us. So some creatures that are really neat are, let's first take a look at Grand Abolisher. If you haven't noticed by now, the game plan of this deck is very fragile. A counterspell here or there could wind up with your board having 0 lands whatsoever and set you back to the Stone Age. So I will say it's a glass cannon in that regard, for little payoff to extreme payoff, depending on where you're at in the state of the game. But for 2 white mana, a Grand Abolisher, and again, it's a cheap creature, so with Queen Kaayla, we can wheel this away and reanimate it, right? But, try to stop the opponents from having interaction. I'm always looking at players' mana base, like, are they tapped out? Are they playing blue? How can they interact with me? Grand Abolisher puts a cabiche to that, so you're free to take your game actions as you see fit. Recent addition, which I think is really funny, Countryside Crusher was added for 3 mana, 2 of it being red. It reads, at the beginning of your upkeep, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it into your graveyard. Repeat this process, and whenever a land card is put into your graveyard from anywhere, put a +1/+1 counter on Countryside Crusher. So you can mill it. For say, you could sack your lands, and with your lands going in and out of your graveyard all game, be getting a lot of counters as well, so it could be a threat. Really funny, but is an easy way to churn through our deck to hit the things we want, because we'll have things like land tax, putting cards into our hand for us, and just hit the stuff we want. So keep throwing those lands into the bin easily with upside. And I think the best creature in the deck, and I'm glad I stumbled across this bad boy, because it's Cavalier Flame for 5 mana, 3 red pips, being that it's a creature, elemental knight, has a mana outlet, which if you had a ton of mana, you can also pump this if people are open and win the game. But it also reads, when it enters the battlefield, discard any number of cards and draw that many cards. So easy way to put even more lands into our graveyard. Then it reads, when Cavalier of Flame dies, it deals X damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control, where X is the number of land cards in your graveyard. So we went through how easily it is to fill your graveyard with lands in general. So if you have, by the end of your game plan, let's say 20 to 25 lands in there, as soon as Cavalier dies, you're going to be hitting your opponents for a ton of damage. And if you have the setup of Cavalier Flame, some sack outlet, however that may be, including a creature as well. So we'll say Greater Gargantuan, and then a Faithful Reward or Second Sunrise in hand. You can go through the cycle of first sacking all your lands to Zurinorb, then sacking Cavalier Flame, and then casting Second Sunrise. So you're not only netting that mana, you're also dealing a ton of damage to your opponents. And with Second Sunrise, you could do it all again, which is really neat to see. So that is between Cavalier Flame, Spiteful Repossession. These are the two main win cons of the deck, but they're not limited to that. We take a look down further. Something that helps us engine get online a lot faster is Soulful Mayhem Dominus. This card reads, if a source you control deals non-combat damage to an opponent or permanent opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. So you could put more doubling effects. Soulful having an indestructible as a creature, I think, is very powerful. Also is a discard outlet to lands. This is the type of stuff I'm looking for when creating this deck. Discard 2 cards is a positive for us. Indestructible counter, positive again. So we could add more doubling effects. I feel like Soulful alone is good enough because usually you just have enough damage. Speaking of discard outlets, another potential win con we have is Land's Edge and Seismic Assault. Discard a land from your hand, deal 2 damage to target creature or player. And Land's Edge is a funny one because it's basically another Seismic Assault. However, it's a world enchantment. So then everybody has the option to discard a land and do the same thing, which is really neat. I like the group. I like the effects that affect the entire board, and so on. And besides that, that is the main game plan, and how you string it together can look different every game, which is really cool. I'll go down the other aspect of the deck is getting, when we have all these lands in our hand, what are we trying to do besides, send them in and out of the graveyard? We are looking to continuously wheel. So Valakut Awakening, Path of the Pyromancer, and Leave Chance are great. Path of the Pyromancer, recent edition, because when you discard all these cards, you're adding red for each, and then drawing that many +1. Will the Planeswalker, not important, unless you're playing Plane Chase. Valakut Awakening is a dual modal card. It's a land drop, but also a wheel. So you can see as we fill up our hand with lands, we're going to be drawing more and more each time. Just some other nice creatures. Archer's Ogma can have too much card draw. And a real fun scenario to get into is Leave and Chance. So this reads, instant, return any number of target permanents you control to your own hand. So it's another way to set up a combo with like Leave. Let's say you have 7 lands, you can return all the lands in your hand, float some mana, and then later on that same turn, with the floating mana, you can cast a Scholarship Sponsor per se, and automatically catch up with those lands, thinning your deck out. And then also you have a lot of fuel of those 7 lands in your hand to Seismic Assault if you see fit, or you can do the aftermath of Chance, which reads, discard any number of cards and draw that many cards. So you could either do this with some wheel effect that you have, or of course with our commander if she's ready to go. Queen Kaayla. So it's a way to not only have the same amount of lands at least, but also churn through your lands, potentially getting value by hitting your opponent or so on. And then let's go through some fun cards that really help this game plan. Shirley Badgersaur, great card. Discard a creature card, put a +1/+1. We're going to be wheeling a lot, so we're getting a lot of these triggers. Whenever you discard a land card, create a treasure. So this is a way to turn our lands into temporary treasure at least. Gives us some assurance that when we bounce all our lands back to our hand, that and then wheel them away, that we're not going to be left with nothing. And then whenever you discard a non-creature, non-land card, it can fight. So this thing will be growing, creating treasures, all that good stuff. Containment Construct, it was really good with Plarg, but probably pretty good still with the wheels. I'm yet to pull it off, but for 2 mana, whenever you discard a card, you can exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you can play that card this turn. So some insurance for wheeling away something good, because something Queen Kaayla does not care about is instant sorceries and enchantments that we wheel away. So if we wheel away a Felidar Retreat, we can at least exile it with Containment Construct and play it the same turn while still getting that extra good card draw. And I'm just be taking a look at some niche cards here. I like Surveyor Scope is really funny. It's a lot hard to pull off, but it basically says for 2 mana, tap, exile Surveyor Scope, search your library for X basic land cards, where X is the number of players who control at least 2 more lands than you. Put those cards on the battlefield and shuffle. So a neat way to... You could do this with the catch-up mechanic by itself or with the land sack outlet. Let's say everyone has 2 more lands than you. Sack all your lands. Go search for 3 basic lands, which is pretty great on its own. Put them on the battlefield. And then return those lands with like a second sunrise. So now you're ahead on lands. So you're going to be bouncing between getting ahead on lands, putting yourself behind. Because something like Keeper Accord out, you're playing the game differently now, right? You are now, beginning of each opponent's end step, they control more lands than you. So before their end step, you can sacrifice a land if you're even on lands. Go search for a basic. You're deck thinning while also getting more lands into the bin, which is really cool to see every turn cycle. Yeah. So other things that help our game plan go forward is some generic removal. This is a creature, which is extra good for Queen Kaayla. Exile non-land, non-token permanent with moment value 4 or less. Really sweet. Generous gift, of course, any permanent. And Chaos Warp, any permanent, which is fun too. I like to see that card. And then going down and up. Big things for the deck is some recursion spells. So if we do happen to wheel away some important instants or sorceries, we can then return it to our hand and cast it later on. So Shredded Sanity is super nice. Ardent Elemental, same thing. It was tough to find recursion that wasn't exile or give flashback, right? The sorcery we want, because we want to be doing this as much as possible. So Ardent Elementalist makes this happen. I think a sweet card in the deck and should be ran in more Boros decks is Reconstruct History. Return up to 1 target artifact, enchantment, instant, sorcery, up to 1 target's planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand. We can potentially get full value off of this. It gets exiled after, but grabbing even like 2 or 3 of those is huge. Because if we dabble into our board wipes, one of them is the Eternal Wanderer, a planeswalker. Really sweet card to wipe the board, because we really just care about lands, for that matter. Asteri's Command, another dual modal. You can select options, like having options in your board wipe. And lastly is Settle the Wreckage. I haven't yet to do this where I'm taking advantage of it, where I'm exiling all my attacking creatures. That player may search his or her library for basic lands, put them on the battlefield tapped. So not only can you do that against your opponent's creatures, you could use it defensively, offensively in a way, where you exile all your own attacking creatures so you can get that many basic lands. But the whole idea with Settle Wreckage is, though, if we do that to our opponent's creatures, they will automatically be ahead on lands, which allows us to get our land tax triggers easily, Boros Charger triggers more easily, Oath of Lieges, all that good stuff. And in particular, fuels our Spiteful Repossession, right? Because the more lands they have than us, the more treasures we'll be getting. And going down the list, some cute stuff. Mirror Skyrim, we're going to have a lot of basic planes, so it almost doesn't hurt to run this, because you potentially just return a target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield if you control 7 or more planes, which we can do easily in this deck. And then Emiria Shepherd pairs nicely, because we have a lot of planes. If it's a land of his planes, landfall, you may return non-land permanent card to the battlefield instead, so this can recur everything potentially, which is sweet. And then a funny card is Celestial Dawn. Lands you control are planes, non-land permanents you control are white. Same is true for spells you control and non-land cards that aren't on the battlefield. So that's pretty cool. last part is what really helps us is you may spend white mana as though it was any color. You may spend other mana only as though it were colorless mana. So this basically just fixes us, which is really sweet. Because as you can see here, we only run 5 mountains, and the rest are plains. So we're banking on having at least one source of red mana. We usually don't need red mana till later on, but there's a lot of cards that say specifically search for plains. So that's why we run so many plains. You could definitely fluctuate with this number, but if we have a Celestial Dawn out per se, that fixes us entirely, which is cool to see. But then also, lastly, important to point out in the land base, Drain Generator, super nice, because we'll be getting a lot of basic lands to our hand. We could ramp some old-fashioned way by tapping 2, put a extra basic land from our hand on the battlefield tapped. Or something like a Lotus Field or Lotus Veil. You could also put Scorched Ruins, I believe, which I am not currently running in this build, but you could. But basically, enters the battlefield, sacrifice 2 untapped lands, or bury Lotus Field. Not so good. I mean, for us, it's extremely good, right? Add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool. So, essentially what this means, if we have something Archaeomancer land tax set up, is sacrifice 2 lands, add 3 mana, and now every turn cycle, people are going to have more lands in us, especially early on. We're going to be dropping more lands and getting ahead on mana this way. So we could have 7 lands, but if 2 of them are Lotus Field and Lotus Veil, we're actually net positive 4 mana on our opponents, which is really cool to see. And then Flagstones of Torquer, pretty cool, because when you do sacrifice it, which you're going to be sacrificing your own lands, you get a basic land. So you can take advantage of this with your Recursion of all spells, your Second Sunrise, all that good stuff. Yeah, and then the last category we're really taking a look at is your tutors here. We're running 2. Urza Saga, because there's a lot of utility, cheap artifacts you can grab that cost 0 or 1. In particular, a Zurian Orb, or if you need that Recursion spell now, you can get the Gerard's Hourglass Pendant. If you want to keep your hand while you're wheeling, grab a Library of Lang, because if you discard a card, you can put it on top of your library instead of the graveyard, which is a nice option to have, especially our sorcery spells. Because we don't want to pitch all our sorceries to the bin, especially our Recursion ones. Or we could grab, what was I looking for? Amulet of Vigor, because this is an all-starter deck. Allows us to really ramp up when our lands don't come in tapped, because we have a lot of effects like that when we are mass ramping, for instance, like Scholarship Sponsor, because they enter tapped. So this effectively gets our lands online right away, which is cool to see. So a couple tutors are nice. Definitely add more if you see fit. And then lastly, I want to take a look at this card here, because it is a sweet one. Sunforger. Equipped creature gets +4/+0. But, of course, the important part is, you equip 3, but the important part is, for Boros, untapped Sunforger, search your library for a red or white instant card with mana value 4 or less, cast a card without paying its mana cost, then shuffle your library. So this essentially is a extra copy of all these Recursion spells. So now you can, if you don't have one in hand with this on the battlefield, you can instant speed, unattach this card and start your cycle of sacking your lands, getting more lands on the spot, which is really cool to see. If you're ready to go with some Sack Outlet and Cavalier Flame it up, or whatever else you had in mind. So, very powerful card in the deck, which is recently added. So yeah, this is the overview of the deck. It's a little bit, takes a little bit to wrap your head around it, but when you do, it flows super nicely. Yeah, so if you did enjoy this video, please, I'd like to know your thoughts down below in the comments. If there's something you thought was interesting, or if there's just another deck you want me to take a look at, let me know. But without further ado, this has been Momo versus MTG. Thank you for hanging out with me, and without further ado, like, subscribe. I'll see you in the next one. Take care.